The wagon wheels groaned against the rutted dirt road, each turn carrying Grace Sullivan farther away from the only life she had ever known. She pressed her cheek against the rough wooden slats, eyes fixed on the shrinking outline of the Sisters of Mercy orphanage as it disappeared into a haze of dust. 20 years of prayers, thin garl, and patched stockings vanished like smoke in the desert wind. "Sit proper, girl," barked Mrs. Henrietta Blackwood, the hard-eyed woman who had paid $30 silver for Grace's papers. "You ain't no charity case no more. You're merchandise now, and damaged goods don't fetch good prices." Grace straightened her spine against the jolting bench, though her hands trembled in her lap. The other girls in the wagon, three of them, all younger, kept their eyes lowered. They knew well enough that Mrs. Blackwood's riding crop wasn't just for horses. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly as the caravan creaked deeper into the borderlands. Red dust coated everything, their dresses, their faces, even their teeth when they dared open their mouths to breathe. Grace had never seen such emptiness. Mile after mile stretched out before them, filled only with twisted mesquite trees, dry brush, and rocks that shimmered under the heat. Overhead, vultures circled with the patience of death itself. On the second day, they passed a burned-out homestead, its timbers charred and skeletal against the horizon. A child's porcelain doll lay in the dirt, its face cracked by sun and wind. Grace stared until Mrs. Blackwood's voice cut sharp as a whip. "That's what happens to folks who think they're too good for their station. Remember that when you get where you're going." Where she was going. Grace only knew she had been sold as a household companion to some rancher near the New Mexico border. The whispers of the younger girls painted a darker picture, but Grace had seen enough through the orphanage windows to understand. She was to warm a man's bed, cook his meals, and endure whatever hands might claim her in the night. On the fourth day, they stopped at a trading post to water the horses, the air wryer of whiskey, sweat, and tobacco. Grace peered through a dirty window at a card game in progress. A Mexican with silver conchos on his vest caught her eye and winked as he palmed an ace from his sleeve. She turned away quickly, heart hammering, only to hear the smallest girl whisper, "Best keep your eyes down. Miss Blackwood don't like us looking at men, says it gives him ideas." But Grace had always been a watcher. At the orphanage, it was how she had survived, learning which sisters had kind hands, which donors might slip her a penny, which corners were safe to cry in. Watching had kept her alive. She would not stop now. The road grew wilder as they pushed north. Red rock towers rose like ancient sentinels. Rattlesnakes sunned themselves on flat stones, rattling their warning in the still air. One evening, a mountain lion paced the ridge above them, its golden eyes following the wagon until twilight swallowed it whole. On the sixth night, camped by a creek, Mrs. Blackwood finally told Grace her fate. She tore meat from a rabbit bone and said, "Elijah Monroe lives up in the foothills, 15 miles from town. Used to be quite the gunnin', or so they say. Got himself shot up bad a few years back. Legs near useless now." "Why does he need?" Grace began, but Mrs. Blackwood's laugh cut her off. "Why does any man need a woman? He's got money enough to pay, and I've got girls to sell. Simple as that. But here's the thing, girl. Monroe's particulars sent back the last two I brought him. Said they didn't suit. You better suit or you'll be working the saloons in El Paso before month's end." Grace said nothing, though her stomach twisted. She had heard whispers of the saloons, tiny rooms behind curtains, where women served 20 men a night until sickness or violence took them. The final day's journey took them into the mountains. The road shrank to little more than a deer path, winding between pines and boulders. The air turned sharp and cold. Grace pulled her thin shawl tighter, wishing for the wool coat the sisters had sold the winter before. As shadows lengthened, they crested a rise. Below lay a cabin of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney, a barn sagging to the side, and a corral where two weary horses stood. It looked less like a home and more like a place where hope had once come to die. "This is it," Mrs. Blackwood said. Thunder rolled across the sky as fat raindrops began to fall. Grace carried her carpet bag, all she owned in the world, as Mrs. Blackwood strode to the door and pounded her fist. "Monroe, it's Henrietta Blackwood. I've brought your girl for a long moment." Nothing. Then the door opened, and Grace saw him. Elijah Monroe was tall, but leaned heavily on a carved walking stick. His dark hair streaked his jaw, but not the scar carved from temple to cheek. His clothes were plain flannel shirt, worn trousers, boots cracked with age. But it was his eyes that made Grace catch her breath. Gray as a winter sky, eyes that had seen too much. He looked at her, then at Mrs. Blackwood. "She'll do money exchanged hands." Just like that, her life's worth was counted in silver. The wagon rattled away, leaving Grace standing in the rain-soaked yard. Mrs. Blackwood and the other girls vanished into the storm, their pale faces pressed to the window. Monroe turned without another word, limping back inside. He left the door open. Invitation or command, Grace could not tell. She clutched her bag tighter and stepped into the cabin. It was sparse but clean. A stone hearth dominated the main room, a rocking chair by the window, shelves crowded with books, more books than Grace had ever seen outside the orphanage library. Two doors opened off the main room. Monroe pointed to one. "That's your room. You'll sleep there. I'll not have you in my bed." Grace blinked. Surely she had misheard. "Sir," his eyes flashed. "I said you'll have your own room. I need someone to cook, clean, tend the horses when my leg fails me. That's all. I didn't ask for obedience, didn't ask for a woman to warm my bed. I asked for," he stopped, jaw tight, then turned toward his room. "Get yourself dry. There's kindling by the hearth if you want a fire. I'll not have you sick your first night." The door shut behind him with a soft click. Grace stood in the cabin's silence, dripping on the wooden floor. She had prepared herself for rough hands, for whiskey breath, for pain endured in silence. She had not prepared for this, for mercy, if that's what it was. Outside, lightning split the sky, and thunder shook the earth. In that flash, she saw the loneliness seeping from the walls, the dust on the unused rocking chair, the careful order of a man barely holding himself together. She picked up her bag and entered her small room. A narrow bed, a washstand, a faded quilt sewn long ago by some woman's patient hands. She sat and at last let tears fall, not of fear, not even of sorrow, but of confusion. Her fate had been sealed. Yet nothing was as she had expected, and that uncertainty frightened her more than Mrs. Blackwood's threats ever had. The rooster's crow split the thin mountain air like a blade. Grace startled awake, aching from the narrow bed. For a moment she thought she was back at the orphanage, but the silence was wrong. No rows of girls snoring, no morning bells, just the crackle of firewood and the faint clink of iron. She dressed quickly in her second dress, worn but cleaner than the first, and stepped into the main room. Elijah Monroe was already there, stoking the fire. His movements were careful, favoring his bad leg yet steady. He didn't look at her, just kept feeding kindling to the flames. "I can do that," Grace offered. He paused, then stepped back without a word. She knelt by the hearth, coaxing the fire until it roared. His gaze pressed on her like the weight of a stone. Coffee's in the tin on the shelf, bacon's in the cold box. Hens should have eggs. His voice was rough like gravel dragged across wood. More words than he'd spoken since she arrived. Grace nodded and set to work. She gathered eggs from the hens, noting one with a lame foot. She found bacon and a loaf of sourdough in the cold box, along with vegetables that had seen better days. She made do, as she always had. By the time the food was on the table, she felt almost steady. They ate in silence. She noticed he cleaned his plate, but offered no thanks. When he finished, he rose, leaning on his stick. "I'll be in the barn. Horse with a split hoof needs tending." Grace hesitated. "Should you, with your leg?" He looked at her sharply. For a moment she thought she had overstepped, but instead of anger, a flicker of surprise crossed his face. "Should I?" He gave a bitter half-smile. "Maybe not, but horses don't care for my comfort. Neither does the ranch." He left without another word. Grace spent the morning cleaning. The cabin was solid but tired, its corners lined with mouse droppings, its stove temperamental. She scrubbed floors, beat dust from the rug, set beans to soak for supper. The rhythm of work eased her mind. Through the window, she watched Elijah in the corral. He worked slowly, favoring his leg, but his hands were sure. The horses trusted him, leaning into his touch. He moved like a man born to the saddle, trapped in a body that had betrayed him. The first week passed in careful routine. Grace rose early, cooked, cleaned, tended the hens. Elijah worked until exhaustion left him gray-faced and tight-lipped. They ate together but spoke little beyond the needs of the day. Yet she learned him anyway. The way he liked his coffee black and strong, his eggs fried over easy, his shirts pressed with neatness that hinted at pride he didn't admit. At night he read by lamplight, everything from penny dreadfuls to Shakespeare. Snow fell on the 10th day, blanketing the hills in silence. Grace woke to the world turned white. She found Elijah in the barn, straining to pitch hay. His leg buckled, his face twisted with pain, but he kept at it. "Let me," Grace said, reaching for the pitchfork. "You ever pitched hay?" "No, but I can learn." He studied her a moment, then handed her the fork. "Keep your back straight, use your legs, and watch that mare. She bites when she's hungry." It was harder than she imagined. Within minutes, her arms burned. Her back screamed, but she kept going, refusing to yield. They worked in silence, their breaths visible in the frigid air. By the end, sweat dampened her hair despite the cold. That night, the cabin shook with the storm. Grace piled every blanket she could find on her bed, but the chill bit through. Finally shivering, she crept to the main room to build the fire. Elijah was already there, sitting in the rocking chair with a blanket around his shoulders. The firelight carved shadows into the scar across his face. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, too cold. "First winter for me outside the orphanage." He nodded slowly. "It gets easier, or you get tougher. Hard to say which." She settled on the floor near the fire, pulling her shawl tight. "How long have you lived here?" 6 years. Bought the place after." He trailed off, jaw tightening. Grace didn't press. She had learned his silences were walls, not doors. "You shall learn to shoot," he said suddenly. "What a woman alone out here needs to protect herself. Wolves come down hungry. Sometimes men do too. I'm not alone, she reminded him. He gave a bitter laugh. A crippled gunfighter's not much protection. You're not crippled. Yes, I am. His tone was flat. Matter of fact, bullet shattered my knee. On good days, I walk almost normal. On bad days, I can't stand. A man who can't trust his own body can't protect anyone. Grace studied him in the firelight. The scar on his face seemed deeper, etched by more than one wound I'd like to learn, she said softly. He met her eyes, something unreadable flickering in his gray gaze. Tomorrow if the snow lets up. But the snow didn't let up. For 3 days it felt steady and relentless. The cabin became a cage. Elijah paced like a trapped wolf, his uneven gait wearing grooves in the floor. On the third night, Grace heard a crash. She ran to find him sprawled on the floor, his face twisted in pain. Don't, he growled as she reached for him. She ignored him, sliding an arm under his shoulders. Stop being stubborn. I said don't, and I'm not listening. She pulled with all her strength, half dragging him to his bed. His weight pressed her to the edge of breaking, but she managed. His room was sparse, its walls lined with drawings, horses, landscapes, faces rendered in fine pencil strokes. You drew these? She asked, easing him down a long time ago. Different life sweat beaded his forehead as he clenched his teeth. Bottle in the trunk. Laudanum. She found it along with bandages in a jar of foul-smelling salve. How often does it get this bad? Often enough. Nothing the doctor can do. That night, Grace sat in a chair by his bed. Elijah burned with fever, thrashing in dreams. He muttered names. Samuel, James, Maria, his past spilling out in fragments. She pressed cool cloths to his brow, held water to his lips, whispered steady words though he couldn't hear. When dawn came, the fever broke. Elijah opened his eyes to find Grace slumped over the bed, asleep, her hands still clasping his. Something softened in his scarred face. You stayed, he said when she stirred. Someone had to. No, no one had to. His voice was rough, but his gaze held hers longer than before. Grace rose, stretching her stiff limbs. I'll make breakfast. She turned to go, and for the first time, he said her name. Grace. She paused. Thank you. After that night, something shifted between them. The silence remained, but it was no longer cold. It was waiting, like earth beneath snow, holding seeds yet to bloom. The storm broke at last, leaving the hills wrapped in a glittering quilt of snow. The world looked new, but inside the cabin, something deeper had changed. Grace and Elijah moved around each other with a different kind of awareness now. Their words came easier, their silences softer. When the sun finally returned, Elijah kept his promise. He placed his old Navy Colt in Grace's hands, showing her how to hold it, how to breathe, how to aim. Her first shot rang wide, spooking the hens and echoing down the valley. She winced, but Elijah only smiled faintly. Don't fight the gun, he said, stepping close enough that his breath warmed her ear. It's just a tool, trusted. By week's end, Grace could hit 3 tin cans out of 5. Elijah nodded his approval, pride shining in eyes that rarely revealed anything. Grace felt that pride wrap around her like warmth against the cold. The weeks of winter rolled on. They worked side by side, hauling water, chopping wood, tending animals. Grace learned to read Elijah's pain and the set of his jaw, the way his hand tightened on his cane. On bad days, she took on his chores without a word. On good days, they worked in rhythm. 2 people carving out survival together. Somewhere in those bitter nights, Grace stopped feeling like a stranger in his house. She began to feel like something else. something closer. The thaw came slow. Drips of water fell steady from the eaves, marking the end of winter. Grace stood one morning at the fence, watching Elijah train a young colt. His movements were firm but patient, his voice low and steady. For the first time she saw him smile, a small, almost startled thing, when the colt nuzzled his hand. "You're staring," he said without turning. Heat rose to Grace's cheeks, just wondering if you needed help. "Come here, then." She slipped through the fence rails, approaching the colt with careful steps. Its black coat shone under the sun, a white star marking its forehead. Elijah nodded for her to hold out her hand, palm flat. The colt sniffed, then nudged her fingers with its soft nose. Grace laughed, and the sound made Elijah's eyes soften. "You've got a touch with them." He said rare thing. My brother Samuel had it too. It was the first time Elijah had spoken freely of his past. Grace held still, afraid to break the spell. "He was 17 when he died at Chickamauga," Elijah continued, his voice flat as if forcing the words out. "I was supposed to protect him." "You were in the war?" Grace asked gently. 3 years. Texas cavalry. Came home to nothing. Family dead. Ranch gone. So I lived by the gun. He touched his bad leg, made money, made enemies. One of them took his payment and lead. Grace reached out, brushing her fingers across his sleeve. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Elijah said, his eyes unreadable. "Man makes choices, lives with the weight of them." That evening, instead of retreating to his books, Elijah brought out a deck of worn cards. "You play." "The sisters would have beaten us bloody for it," Grace admitted. "Then it's time you learned. They played by firelight beans for stakes." Grace learned quickly, spotting the way Elijah's thumb brushed his jaw when he held a strong hand, the narrowing of his eyes when he bluffed. "You're cheating," she accused after losing her fifth-round teaching. He corrected, "Never play with someone you don't trust." He studied her across the table, his gray eyes storm dark. "Do you trust me, Grace?" The question hung between them like smoke. She felt her heart pound as she whispered, "I'm starting to spring painted the hills with wildflowers, purple lupine, red paintbrush, yellow colleen." Grace filled jars with bouquets for the table, colors seeping into the cabin shadows. One evening, Elijah stood behind her as she arranged flowers. His voice was quiet. "Maria used to do that." Grace froze. "Maria." His jaw tightened. "My fiancée before the war. She waited for me, but I came back broken and mean. I pushed her away, told her she deserved better." Quote, Grace's hands stilled on the flowers. Maybe she would have chosen to stay. Maybe his eyes found hers then, raw with something she couldn't name. "I've made a life of choosing for others. I chose for her. I chose for you when I told myself you'd only be a servant here." Grace's breath caught. "I don't understand." "You don't?" He stepped closer, voice low and unsteady. "I sent back those other girls, not because they didn't suit, but because they reminded me I was still a man with a man's wants. Safer to be alone. But you," his voice broke, "I watch you work and forget to breathe. At night I hear you moving in your room, and I wish, but what I wish doesn't matter." Grace's heart thundered. She wanted to speak to close the space between them, but Elijah turned away sharply, retreating to the porch. That night, neither of them slept. When Grace finally left her room, she found him by the fire, his cane leaning against the chair. He didn't look at her when he said, "I don't want obedience, Grace. I don't want a woman bought for silver. I want you, just you as you are." Her throat tightened, but she stepped closer. "Then have me." Elijah lifted his eyes to hers, pain and longing written across his scarred face. Not like this. Not until you're certain. You deserve a choice. He reached out, brushing her hand with his rough fingers. Come to me when you know it's what you want, not what you think I need. For the first time in her life, Grace realized she truly had a choice, and that more than anything terrified